Throughout the history of the video game industry, there have been many, many developments. Now, some people come into the industry, go out, very short period of time. Some people have very concentrated focus and specialize on one area. Today's guest has been at many companies, had many different positions, and, well, made one of my all-time favorite games, which we definitely will talk about. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome to the show Jeff Johannigman.
Thank you very much.
Now, Jeff, let's go back to the beginning, as we always like to do here. And what's your educational background? Where do you start out?
So way back in high school, in the 70s, our high school had a connection to the local university, PDP 11. And when I discovered that they had a whole game library of like these text adventures and Star Trek grid games and so on and so forth, I got hooked on that then. Ended up going to college at Cornell University, which is one of the most prestigious of computer science departments. Wow. And while I was not really very studious about completing my class assignments, during my junior year, I got one of the early Atari 800 computers with a whopping 48K and a cassette tape drive. And instead of working on my class assignments, I was working on a game called Rabbots, which I heard from a friend that Atari had this division called the Atari Program Exchange, which would take user-written software and put out a catalog every quarter, and even gave out an award on a quarterly basis for the best submissions that they got. So I submitted Rabbots to Atari for the Atari Program Exchange, and they accepted it for publication, and I was delighted. And a few months later, I go down to my dorm room, my dorm mail room, and open up my mailbox, and there's like a check for $300.
Wow!
And I'm college kid in the '80s. I'm going, I'm going to be rich, fabulously wealthy, and so on and so forth. And I wrote another game for them called Snark Hunt. I got to be careful how you pronounce that, Snark Hunt, which was a logic puzzle game. And that not only was published, but they gave it one of their awards, which was $1,000 worth of Atari merchandise, which actually finally got me a disk drive. So I was writing these first two ones on cassette tape back then. So I finally got a disk drive to work with.
Sorry, just to get some of the chronology right here. So, what year are you entering college? 1980.
So I was in college from 79 through 83.
Okay.
And these games were published, I think, in 82.
Okay. Yeah. So it's after the first year of the contest, the first star, and then so 82, 83 makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That sounds
cool.
About right.
Sorry. Yeah.
And toward the end of my senior year, I start interviewing with the classic corporate recruiters, IBM and Procter & Gamble and Hewlett Packard and so on. And every company I talked to and every recruiter I spoke to and every company I visited, I started getting more and more depressed going, I don't want to work for these guys. I really don't. And when I was flown out to interview at Hewlett Packard, I talked to Broderbund Software and said, hey, would you mind if I just popped up and talked to you guys while I'm out here in the Bay Area? And so I interviewed with Broderbund the day after I interviewed with Hewlett Packard. And I met this guy who had office full of Muppets and Star Wars toys and stuff. And going, okay, one path is endless sea of cubicles for a giant corporation, and the other one is getting to work with the guy who's got all the Muppets and the Star Wars toys. So my first job out of college was for Broderbund Software doing some Atari conversions of some of their adventure games that they had licensed.
Interesting. So, okay, so you studied computer science, just in general. Okay.
And I can tell you the Cornell Computer Science Department is one of the absolute most prestigious ones for computer science theory. I was woefully prepared to actually do assembly language programming. So I had to kind of learn that on the fly and on the go in my job at Broderbund. But yes, no, it was
Okay.
totally unprepared for the real job that I had.
Well, and that brings up a good question. Those programs that you submitted to the Atari Program Exchange, what were you programming those in if it wasn't an assembler?
BASIC. They were actually written in BASIC. I mean, okay, you know, one was a more standard arcade-ish game. The other one was just a strategy game. So speed was not a critical issue on StarCon. But yes,
Gotcha.
Yeah, I was doing it all in BASIC back then. And then when I first got to work for Broderbund, it's like, okay, how quickly can I do a crash course on 6502 assembly language?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And now, did you do any programming at all on the PDP, or was that just basically interacting with the existing software?
Oh, I was doing some. My first experience programming back in high school, a friend of mine had been working on a Star Trek style game. Mm-hmm. He had written in BASIC, and I said, "Can I see how you did that?" And he printed out the source code for that, and I took it home and read through it and said, "Oh, this makes sense. This looks fairly easy." So essentially, I taught myself BASIC overnight in high school and discovered I had an aptitude for this stuff. But realistically, I was never as happy just being a programmer as when I got to doing more people-oriented producer work.
And that's going to be interesting because that transition, a lot of people don't succeed at that transition.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And so that'll be something that we need to talk about. So, okay, so you take this job at Broderbund, and they've hired you as a programmer to port code, and you have to now learn assembler.
Yes.
I am curious because porting is always, especially as a kid of the 80s, porting was an interesting concept.
Yeah.
Now, what was the system like at Broderbund for ports? Were you given source code from the Apple for the Atari versions? Were you simply given a copy of the program? Did you talk to the original coders? What was the idea like there?
No, first day on the job, they handed me this big stack of the printout for the source code for the Apple II code. Okay?
Oh, wow.
Yes, right. And essentially, you know, you practically rewrote it from scratch. You know, I could cut and paste some of the logic to it, but everything that had to do with the graphics, everything had to do with sound had to be rewritten from scratch. And I had to figure out a way to get the Atari screen to duplicate the color set that the Apple used. And so we didn't have to redo all of the actual artwork in a way. And that was an interesting, tricky proposition.
Oh my goodness. So, okay. Yeah, that sounds like a freaking nightmare. And you're doing the whole thing on your own. There's no additional support.
One-man job. Yep.
Wow.
But this was the early 80s. Almost every game was a one-man job.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. So you're doing these ports to the Atari. Now, this is 1983, right?
83, yes.
Okay, so the market is changing rapidly in 1983.
Yeah, essentially at that point in time was right after Atari basically went belly up. And the ripple effects of that went throughout the rest of the industry for the next couple of years. So right after I finished my two projects for Broderbund, they did a layoff, and I was one of the people cut in that layoff.
Okay.
I went over to Synapse software, if you remember anything about Synapse software.
Very much so, yes.
Okay. And they needed somebody to do the opposite port. They had an Atari stress management system called Relax.
Yes.
Sounds like you've seen this before.
I've interviewed Jerry Wolosenko.
Oh, Jerry Wolosenko, not Ihor?
Not Ihor, no. I talked to Jerry. I originally got a hold of him because of some work he did later on.
Oh, okay.
And we actually are very good friends. We still have a bi-weekly chat for the last 5 years now that we do. Yeah, well, nice guy.
Let him know that I have unbound respect and admiration and love for Ihor for one particular reason. Okay. And that is that the summer of, I guess it was '84, he organized a company picnic and did an amazing job of trying to make sure that everybody was having a great time, all the families and so on and so forth. And a couple of days later, he had to announce all the layoffs and the shutdown of Synapse. And I'm looking at him going, my God, he knew what was coming. He knew during that picnic that, you know, there was death to be had. But he worked his ass off to make sure that we all had an amazingly great time together before the company ended up going under and all. So I have great respect. And the Relax project was his baby too. It was a brilliant idea. So I got to do, they had originally done Relax on the Atari, and I got to do the Apple port. So I went in the opposite direction on that one. And then I was one of the people laid off, obviously. And then that's when I ended up going over to Epyx. Now, this little Commodore 64 G.I. Joe game.
And we were definitely going to jump into that. But just before we move on, so how difficult was it for you to do that Apple port? Because obviously you haven't worked on an Apple up until this point.
No, I had to learn the Apple graphic system in reverse because I had learned to take stuff from the Apple into the Atari, and then I had. But by that point in time, I'd figured out how most of it worked pretty readily, and I licensed a graphics driver for the Apple that made it fairly easy. But I had to change some things because the Atari version of Relax had an ongoing scrolling screen that was monitoring your stress. I had to do what looked more like a classic heart monitor, where things went across the screen, and then when it went, then it skipped back to the beginning, and then skipped back to the beginning, and so on and so forth. So it got the job done. It wasn't as pretty as the Atari.
Yeah, it's an Apple too. Yeah. Now, one more thing, and it goes more towards the business structure. At both Broderbund and Synapse, were you hired as a full-time employee, or was it more of a work-for-hire type of situation?
Yes and yes. At Broderbund, I was an employee, and they even went so far as to give me a relocation advance that got me moved from my home in Ohio to moving out to California, and that was kind of nice. The salary was so low, I don't even want to admit to it anymore. But my project for Synapse was just a contract project.
Gotcha.
And
okay.
So that was just, also very low.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you said then you moved over to Epyx. Now, and I have to ask now also, obviously the Broderbund, you contacted them to do that. How did you get in touch with Synapse? And the reason I'm asking these questions is just to give people an idea of what networking in the industry was like back then.
Oh, yeah. To be honest, I had to kind of, do a little research and digging up who was in charge of the actual product development and give that person a call and said, hey, I just finished a project for Broderbund. Are you interested? And do you have any need for any programmers? And got lucky on that one. Getting the job for Epyx was a more interesting story. And that is that by that time, I had developed a little bit of a network of friends who were working in the game industry. And we were all playing together in a board game of diplomacy.
Oh, cool.
Diplomacy, right.
I haven't played it, but I know of it, yes.
Yeah, so and this was I don't remember if it was play by email. I think we had play by email back. Yeah, play by email. So we had two turns a week that we were turning in for that. And I was in the middle of negotiating with one of the other countries, and the player who was playing that was working for Epyx. And I said, okay, so what is this deal between England and Germany worth to you? And if I were to give you a resume, would you get it into the right hands? And then we can. And sure enough, and that was Scott Nelson, and his brother Craig Nelson was in charge of product development at the time at Epyx.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Oh man, I wish somebody would have kept those logs. I'd love to see who was playing in that game.
Yeah. I know it was Scott, and I'm pretty sure David Bunch was in that crowd as well. I can't remember who the other people were on that game. Yeah. So,
oh, wow.
Well, you remember these names. Wow, you're good.
Come on. EA, one of the original EA guys, David Bunch. I mean.
Well, not original EA guys, but I actually, when I was at EA and EA made the decision to start an internal development team, I recruited David Bunch and I recruited Michael Kasaka, who was the artist from Epyx, to come over to EA.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And,
we will definitely
and Stephen Landrum, but we'll get back to that. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, come on. We're talking now the creation of Skate or Die.
Yes, of course. Mm-hmm. Anyway,
okay.
Back to Epyx. I know there's a
Sorry. No. I'm just saying because before we started the interview, I talked about having played hundreds of hours of G.I. Joe. There's almost an equal number of hours invested in Skate or Die in my life. So yeah. Okay, so you get into Epyx.
Yes.
And now I'd like to, because these are three key companies in those early years of the home computer video game industry. Yeah. When you get there, how does Epyx as a company, as an impression, as the feeling of the place differ from what you had seen at Broderbund and at Synapse?
Probably the biggest difference was in terms of the head of the company. They were all very similar in size. It was like under 50 people each, and still a good number of geeky developers and so on. But Epyx was being run by Michael Katz, who was not an artist, not a game designer, not any of those. He came out of the toy industry. And the first thing he did when he got appointed to run Epyx was go out and license Barbie and Hot Wheels and G.I. Joe. And he basically gave us the directive of, these are not going to be games, they're going to be computer activity toys. And after I was assigned to working on G.I. Joe, I asked the other guys around going, what does he mean by computer activity toy? And they basically said, just do a game, just don't keep score. Don't declare a winner, just do a game. Okay, great, fine, all right. So when I got onto G.I. Joe, Ray Carpenter had already started work on the vehicles portion of the game. And there was some prototype version of the vehicles portion of the game. And he knew a little bit about G.I. Joe from the some of the early toys that were out. But this was before the TV series even was out on the air. Yeah. And I had friends who were into the anime, early anime fandom. And I could get from them a bootleg copy of the G.I. Joe pilot film.
Oh.
And we sat down one afternoon and watched that together and freeze framed a few of the shots from there. So that Ray's wife, Pam, could use that as source for some of the artwork there.
That explains the loading screen with the G.I. Joe base that looks nothing like the toy, but is exactly modeled after the cartoon.
The only source reference we had was that pilot movie, because this was before even, most of the really cool ones were barely out on there. Mm-hmm. And then the fun part for a kid my age at the time was they also gave me a budget of several $100s to go down to Toys R Us and buy all of the G.I. Joe toys. So I filled my office with, the Baroness figures and so on. So
awesome.
I had a little crush on Baroness, but
trust me,
she stayed on top of my monitor. Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're developing this now. It is obviously a licensed property.
Yes, right.
Did you?
And Michael Katz did not understand the license. He kept asking, "Which of these guys is G.I. Joe?" And I'm going, Michael, this is not the 12-inch figure from the 60s. I'm sorry, this is a whole new concept. It's a team. It's not a person. And a week later, you come back in and look at the screen, going, "Which one is G.I. Joe?" Yeah.
I've interviewed Michael, and I keep in touch with him. I totally get that. I totally get it. He is, I totally get it. Okay, so you're developing this. And it's basically two different games because you have that vehicle section, which is completely divorced in design and concept,
right,
from the game mechanics from this other section. How did that idea even? Well, it was obviously there before you were assigned to the project,
right,
to have it split. Was there ever an explanation of why the split, or?
Well, just when you look at the toys, there's vehicle toys and there's action figure toys. And the question is, how do you do justice to both play experiences? So, Ray took on we're going to get to fly the cool airplanes. We're going to get to drive the cool tanks and so on and so forth. And I got to do what I thought was infinitely more fun, which was the man-to-man combat. And I approached it having a background of years and years in paper tabletop role-playing games, to go, if I wanted to differentiate these guys, what would the ways that they would be different from each other? They would be different in terms of hit points. They would be different in terms of how quickly they could run and move around. They would be different in terms of what weapons they had, in terms of how much damage they could do, how quickly they would reload. What are all the variables I could work into the game to create a differentiation between all of these characters that you could choose from? And I have to admit to the joke that I did ask to put Snow Job and Blowtorch next to each other. And people immediately saw the joke, but nobody actually said it out loud. Nobody said it out loud.
You know what? Until you just said it now, I never even clicked in my head. But
really, Snow Job, Blowtorch.
I played it when I was such a small kid that for me it's just absolutely natural. And to try to read something dirty into this thing would be almost sacrilege. But I love it. I love it.
Way. I couldn't resist. So anyway. But yeah, now for me, the most fascinating part as a programmer is the part that nobody ever seemed to notice or appreciate, which is on a Commodore 64, I was able to create a scenery-scape with cars and phone booths and mailboxes and consoles that you could walk behind and in front of seamlessly on there. And that took some I'm still proud of it to this day, 40 years later, hella clever programming to get the sprites to clip correctly and mask behind the scenery elements and so on and so forth. And, people commented about what they loved about the game and all sorts of different stuff, but nobody ever mentioned, hey, it's so cool that you can go all the way around all these items.
Well, those obstacles, and here, for those who have not played the game, I guess a little bit of description is warranted.
Okay.
So in these one-on-one combat scenarios, it's single screen. There's no scrolling, but each of the scenarios, and I can't remember exactly how many there are, maybe 6 or 7 of them.
There were really only 4.
Only 4.
There was a snowscape. There was a city street. And there was a Cobra headquarters. Headquarters
and the desert, yes.
Yes, right.
Yeah. And in each one of them, there would be different obstacles, if you will. So non-player enemies that could jump out. Sometimes they were neutral, like in the Cobra headquarters, there's the Cobra head that keeps popping out, but that'll shoot indiscriminately at everybody. In the desert, there's a flying G.I. Joe vehicle and a flying Cobra vehicle that will, I believe, only shoot at the opposite side, and so on and so forth. And
terrible Cobra headquarters design for their defense system that they couldn't figure out who was friend or foe. You think?
Oh, come on! It's Cobra. I mean, if you can't dodge the lasers, you have not made the cut.
Yes.
It's yeah. And to put it basically in layman's terms, it was very much like a King's Quest screen. So there's the objects that you can walk around, and they would actually block shots. So if you shot at somebody, you could quickly hide behind the phone booth, like you said, and then the shot would hit the phone booth and it wouldn't just go through it. Now, I do have to ask, how was that actually pulled off on the C64? You weren't using sprites for those in-between objects, were you?
No, those were actual background, but there was built into the sprite system a way to prioritize certain pixels over the sprites, and I had to be able to change the priority on the fly and be constantly checking, is your character supposed to be in front of or behind, and then flip a switch as we go each time through, and make sure that those objects were drawn in the correct color register to be able to clip the sprites behind them, which made the Apple II port impossible to do at any sort of reasonable performance, because they just didn't have that sprite support in it, and they had to do it by hand.
Oh yeah. I mean, like I've tried the Apple II port through emulation, and yeah, it's no.
It was sad. So, and the other fun part about this was me actually trying to figure out, because nobody can die in G.I. Joe, right? You know, you had that Saturday morning rule that nobody gets to die. So I had to figure out how many times can you get hit by a rocket launcher before you had to surrender, before you had to put your hands up, you know?
Yeah.
So I figured 2 was about the right number. Other ones, lasers, you could get hit a bunch of times, but you know.
Yeah. And like you said, the role-playing background is clearly visible because the different factors, and let me see if I missed any of them. Each character has a slightly different speed factor. There's a speed, how fast they can move around the screen.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The shots, when they're fired, there's a cooldown period, reload period.
Time, yes.
Which varies from character to character depending on their weapon. The shots move at different speeds, which is a major factor. They have different sized hitboxes. So blowtorch, the fireball from blowtorch is much, much bigger than the machine gun fire from Snake Eyes, for example. Hit points, so how many hits they can take also varies.
Right.
And how much damage each of the weapons causes varies.
Right.
Did I miss any of the factors?
No, that covers it pretty well.
Yeah. But that, given the number
you're stretching my 40-year-old memory, but yes.
Yeah. And so you had 12 Joes and 6 Cobra characters to choose from. Well, 5 because Zartan was...
that was Zartan was fun to do, yes. Yeah, right.
Yeah, and the first time I chose Zartan, and I was somebody who was not familiar almost at all with G.I. Joe when I played this. The G.I. Joe game was my introduction to G.I. Joe.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, and so when Zartan suddenly was changing, was a different character each time, I was like, what the hell is going on here? Yeah. And later on, I picked up some of the comic books and caught up on it to figure out what was going on.
Now, the other thing that people do remember about the G.I. Joe game, for better or for worse, was the cinematic load screens on there. And I don't know if you know Kellen Beck or have talked with Kellen Beck.
No, he's definitely on my list. Yes.
CinemaWare, but he and I were friends, and he mentioned that when he got recruited to do one of the first CinemaWare games, I'm trying to remember the name of the guy.
Defender of the Crown.
Defender of the Crown, but the name of the guy who founded CinemaWare said, we want it to be cinematic, and here's a game that already does something kind of like what I want to do in cutscenes, and that's G.I. Joe. And I'm going, oh my God, I was doing cinematic cutscenes? I thought I was just covering up the 2-minute load time.
You want to hear an interesting anecdote on this?
Yeah.
I spoke to Greg Barnett. He was the developer who did the NES port of Defender of the Crown.
Okay.
And they ran into the problem that every time that you started another one of the mini games, a cartridge doesn't need the load time anymore. And suddenly the game took like 10 minutes to play through the entire game, and they told him, no, you need to add load times to a cartridge game in order to pad the game out. So he had to add in those load times. Sorry. Just pacing. As a side, yeah.
Pacing is everything, yeah.
Oh, but that's amazing because it actually made, obviously, the Commodore 64 notorious for very, very long load times.
It also made Scott Nelson a rich man.
Oh, you mean the fast load cartridge?
Fast load cartridge, yes. Nothing sold as hot as the fast load cartridge.
And was he getting percentages on that?
So the developers at Epyx had a deal where, yes, you got a salary, but you also get, I forget what the exact percentage was. It wasn't a huge royalty, but there was a royalty. And if your sales and royalty exceeded that salary, you'd start collecting royalties. And I actually did get, for a short while, a few $100s worth of royalty checks for G.I. Joe out of that. It was a rare, I've never seen anybody that actually gave its developers both salary and royalty stake, but Epyx did it at the time. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, because that's the the most sold software package for the C64 was the fast load cartridge.
Yes,
by far. I know I had one. Tangents, but that's amazing because Kelly Beck is also on my short list of people I still haven't spoken to.
Gotcha.
Now the okay, so you and those load screens for those who don't know, and I remember people. I always put links to everything we're talking about in the show notes.
Mm-hmm.
Was the G.I. Joe headquarters, and depending on which level you were loading, you'd either see the jet flying by over and over again, or a helicopter, or a tank coming out, or a jeep coming out. And if you were doing the people, then it was the personnel carrier vehicle.
Yeah. And then on the way back, you would often get to see the Cobra headquarters with Cobra Commander cursing you out and saying, "We'll get you in the end."
The scroll at the bottom.
That's right.
I'll get you.
Foiled again.
Now, okay, so you're developing this game. Just don't have a score was the original tagline. And the way that you solved this was that if you ended up capturing all of the Cobra or almost all the Cobra people, one of them would then escape, and so there'd be another Cobra.
It's the Batman dilemma.
Yeah.
You know, that you can only have so many villains in Arkham Asylum before somebody stages a break on there.
Yeah. And so you could play in a single player mode versus a computer. You were always controlling G.I. Joe. And the other alternative would be 2 players, which is really where
controllers,
the game just took off. It was a whole different wonders. Now, I do have to ask, and this was if I have to complain about anything in that game, why were the one-on-one fighting scenes by far the best ones? Because the vehicle ones were very, very difficult to control. Why were they on side 2 of the disc, and why did we keep having to switch back to side 1 to go back to the map?
It really came down to storage space. The art required for the man-to-man combat, all of the different G.I. Joe characters in all the different angles and positions, coupled with the background screens, coupled with the number of animations for all the G.I. Joe villains, was much, much higher than the artwork needs of just one vehicle and a handful of terrain features scrolling in the background. So it just was an issue of where are we going to fit the files for this, because those discs were not big.
No. Because waiting then and having Duke tell me to turn over that disc, I've seen him look at me so many times, pointing at me.
So sorry.
No problem. It was the bane of back then. Luckily,
And, we were developing it before Scott had started selling the fast load cartridges. So we'll probably try to package a fast load cartridge with every one of those. It would have made things a lot easier. By the way, so also, not exactly on G.I. Joe, but there was another team in-house that was simultaneously developing Barbie. I don't know if you've ever talked about Barbie at any point. But
not here on the show, no.
Barbie is one of those wonderfully, what were we ever thinking ideas. When you put a bunch of geeky guys who practically never even talked to girls and never played with girls in charge of a Barbie game. So to give the brief synopsis for your viewers, your listeners, the Barbie game was very, very simple. You start with Barbie relaxing at home, and the phone rings, and it's Ken saying, "Hey, Barbie, let's go on a date. Let's go." And then it would be one of several options. Let's go to the beach. Let's go on a picnic. Let's go play tennis. Let's yada, yada, yada. Barbie would say, "Sure, Ken." And then Ken would say, okay, I'll pick you up at like 4 o'clock, and you've got several hours to then go out and do all the shopping you want to get the right outfit and the right hairstyle and the right shoes and everything else. But then when you get back to your home and ready for your date, then half the time Ken would call up and go, oh, I'm sorry, Barbie, plans have changed. Now we're going to go do this other thing.
Oh, geez.
So, of course, that means you have to go shopping again all over the place.
Oh, no.
What Barbie is, what the one thing I'm proud of about Barbie was it was one of the very first games we actually used voice synthesis or recorded.
Oh,
voice.
really?
Yes. So we could record small snippets of actor voice in a C64 game. And I got to be one of the people who auditioned for the voice of Ken, but I was not Ken enough.
You weren't Ken enough? Oh.
I was not. Nope. I tried. But, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh. Yeah, I honestly have never tried to play that one. Probably, for reasons. Now, I do have one question about the G.I. Joe game. There was an Epyx sort of catalog that was released early on, before the game came out, and it has a screenshot in it. And let me share my screen here with you, and I'll put a link to this. This is from...
I'm probably going to deny any knowledge whatsoever of this, but go ahead.
Yeah.
And show me.
Here. This is from Games That Weren't.
Oh, God, yes. No, this was some artist's mock-up. As soon as Michael Katz got the rights, then those were all quick and dirty artist mock-ups.
Okay, so...
all fair and vaporware.
Okay, good. So just it's not some early version that then that evolved. It's quite literally taking the idea of the original G.I. Joe and just putting different equipment on it.
Right. Yep.
Which probably would explain where Michael was getting the idea from. Where's G.I. Joe?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he probably still had this in his head.
Because that screen looks like it was taking a generic G.I. Joe 12-inch figure and then figuring out what accessories to give them on there. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And it's right next to the Barbie one, which essentially is doing the same thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Choice. Yeah.
Cool.
By the way,
that is a great mystery now solved.
On other Epyx trivia, I don't know if you may remember the game Impossible Mission.
Oh, of course, yes.
Yeah, stay a while, stay forever.
Forever.
That was the first one we did that used voice, that used recorded and pre-synthesized voice. But once we had that technology, then we reused it for Barbie.
Now, were you doing that in-house, or were you having to go to an outside provider for that?
That one was one that one of our programmers actually came up with. I could think that was Dennis Caswell. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes, right. I could be mistaken because that came out just before I joined Epyx, so I'm not sure entirely. But yeah, I worked alongside Dennis Caswell in the offices at Epyx.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So when you're there, and you said there were about 50 people working at the company at the time.
Maybe tops, maybe closer to 40, maybe.
Now, G.I. Joe comes out for the Apple II and the Commodore 64 only.
Right.
In 1984. Was there ever any talk of any other systems that it could be ported to? Especially the IBM, I would have thought maybe PC Junior or something at the time.
Well, I worked on the C64, which was the original version. And less than a month after it was released was when the ripples of the Atari crash hit Epyx. And Epyx laid off most of its programmers, myself included. So I was not even around at the time that they did the Apple II port. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so you shipped the product basically.
Yes. Right.
Were you already assigned a new project before that, or?
I was in that limbo of, okay, we're done with this project. Let's think about what your next one might be. I was in the middle of kind of brainstorming and putting together pitches for other game ideas that I could do that were, my original design, but never got to. And I think when it came time for Epyx to do its layoffs, they were looking at, okay, who's in the middle of a project that we can't let go of, and who hasn't started a new project yet? Okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So these were some tumultuous years because, I mean, you left college in 83.
Yes.
This ships in time for Christmas 84. So if memory serves me right, or is 85 already?
No, I don't think it shipped in time for Christmas of 84. I think it came out early in 85.
Early in 85. Okay.
Early in 85.
So basically you've been through 3 companies in about 2 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
This prepared me for a later career doing career counseling for people who've been laid off from jobs. But we'll get back to that later on.
Definitely, yeah.
But yes, getting laid off 3 times in 2 years. And usually back then, the game companies gave you a check for a few weeks worth of pay and a hearty pat on the back and a good luck, son, on there. So there was no severance package. There were no outplacement consultant. None of that. Nope.
Wow. So do you have any prospects? I should ask first, was this something that you saw coming? Is there a lot of chatter amongst developers at different companies at this point, other than games of diplomacy?
People did start, playing musical chairs, certainly. And so, for example, when Synapse went belly up, they ended up selling or being acquired by Broderbund. So Broderbund could continue publishing some of their stuff, and some of the longer-term Synapse employees ended up becoming Broderbund employees. So yeah, there was some network there, and certainly one of the most valuable skills I learned in doing job hunting was networking. Through all of that. Although my next job actually came from a headhunter, an executive recruiter. Yeah.
So where is it off to then?
Electronic Arts.
Okay.
And at the time, and this was going to hit on something you were talking about earlier, at the time what they needed was a programmer to do their copy protection. I was hired on board to be the copy protection expert, something I knew absolutely nothing about. But I said I would try to learn, and somehow they had faith in me trying to learn. And I spent the first few months on the job posing as a wannabe pirate on some of the pirate BBSs out there at the time, trying to find out which games were being cracked and so on and so forth, figuring out what was more bulletproof than others and so on. And we had a few things that were working, but eventually in that job, I came to appreciate the idea that I was one man going up against an infinite number of hackers with an infinite amount of time. And that no matter how good our copy protection scheme was, it was going to get cracked within less than a month, typically in less than a week. And you could probably attest to that fact, right?
As listeners of the show know, I have talked extensively about my experiences working in this side of the industry during my time as teenager in Argentina. So yes, I can say that this is never something a battle you're going to win.
So basically, at one point in time, I just sat down in one day and wrote up what I refer to as a manifesto, which is I pitched to the whole company to say, we've got to stop doing copy protection. Copy protection is an exercise in futility. We will never be able to stay ahead of the hackers. What we need to do is put some value added in the package itself that is required to play the game. And so if you remember the game Starflight, which was one of our first IBM releases, you may remember Starflight came with a color map and a code wheel. And these were our first package-based theft protection projects. And the sales on Starflight were so much better than almost any other game we did at the time. Partially, I'm sure, due to the fact that it was not getting pirated, it was not getting copied. People actually had to go out and buy copies. This was before people came up with systems for making copies of the code wheel somehow or another and having BBS, but I think it's still in general really reduce the amount of piracy. So we started putting in code wheels into most of our games and paragraph booklets into most of our games, and trying to reproduce a whole paragraph booklet with the technology back then was just odious. And I said, we're not going to make this uncrackable, we're not going to make this unpiratable, but we're going to make it a pain in the ass for somebody to make copies and to pirate. So it's no longer, I'm proud of being the guy who cracked the copy protection. Now it's like, okay, I can go down to the copy shop and pay $5 for a color copy of the map.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes perfect sense. You don't happen to still have a copy of the manifesto, do you?
No, sadly. Again, we're talking about 40 years ago, but.
So, and that's actually phenomenal insight and understanding. I mean, something that a lot of companies never quite grasped. Now, was there a concern that by putting in those code wheels, it would have maybe felt like a punishment for the people who bought a legitimate copy?
We actually tried to make it feel like a fun thing to do and legitimately part of the experience. And more to the point, interestingly, we also made it part of the philosophy that if you didn't have the code wheel or if you didn't have the correct code, you could still play the game for about 20 minutes. And then suddenly your ship gets pulled over in Starflight by the space cops to go, there's been a lot of piracy in the area and we're going to have to check your credentials again, sir. My apologies. So we basically then treated any pirated copy as, okay, here's your sample. Here's your to whet your appetite. But if you really want to play the game, you got to buy the code wheel. And I think people got it. That we were trying to make it a fun part of the fiction. I think particularly the paragraph booklets enhanced the game experience because there was no way you could fit that much story text on a disc at the time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in Argentina, we always had a problem. Many role-playing games just never caught on, partially because of a language barrier, but also because those additional materials were missing. Yeah.
Wasteland and the Bard's Tale. And
I was about to say Wasteland was the prime example for us because that was a game that, especially with the Mad Max movies being as big as they were in the 80s, we wanted that game to be distributable, but without the manual. And a few people had photocopied versions of the entire manual. But after the fifth generation, you could barely read what was going on. You don't want to know what my photocopied manual for Deluxe Paint 3 looked like. That was a nightmare. But again, we had no legitimate software market. There was no way for us to get anything otherwise. But that's another ballgame.
Yes, the statute of limitations
has expired. Wrong jurisdiction. Yep. I buy my software nowadays. I've gone legit. But now the question is, so you're developing these systems, and you've convinced them not to do software copy protection.
Right.
Does that automatically inside EA transfer you into some kind of supervisory role in developing these different techniques for in-package copy protections?
I did coordinate and manage some of that initially, but then I managed to get myself promoted into a position that was actually a little more creative. And I got to become an associate producer eventually and got to work on some actual games.
Okay. Now, and we've talked on the show before about the producer role at EA, how it was originally modeled after the music industry. Mm-hmm. So what was an associate producer's role? At this, and so we're talking what, 86, 87 at this point?
Yeah, about 86, 87,
okay.
Give or take. Yeah, let me think. Yeah, I think that was about it because I got married in 87 and I was an associate producer at the time. Okay, so I worked under one of the best people I ever could imagine working for, David Grady. David Grady was one of the early producers of Electronic Arts. I mean, we had an astounding stable of producers, Joe Ibarra and Stuart Bond and Don Daglow and David Grady. They were just phenomenal talent. But because we wanted to expand the bandwidth of projects that they could shepherd, then they brought in assistant producers and then associate producers. And they first brought in assistant producers. And then when they found somebody who was a little too senior to be hired as an assistant producer, but not senior enough to be a full producer, they created this title of associate producer. And that really pissed off the assistant producers who thought they were next in line to become full producers. But we had Mike Kawahara and Shelley Day, who were good friends of mine, who were some of the first assistant producers. But associate producer, I had, I think, 4 or 5 games under development that I was the primary contact with the developer, the primary editorial input, the primary kind of in-house creative input with the project teams that I was working with. And so I worked on a few games there. I was also, for a while, a technical director, which meant I got to help out troubleshooting some technical issues with some games. And got things like the joystick responsiveness to work better on the Apple II for Lords of Conquest, really kind of trivial things. The game I think I had the most creative input on was Demon Stalkers on the Commodore 64. And that was when I was working with a team down in Australia, who I didn't ever meet any of those developers face to face until after we shipped Demon Stalkers. But it was a fun project to work on, yeah.
Now, it's 87. What does being a producer for a team that's on another continent actually look like? What's the day-to-day interaction like?
So we're talking about actually using this newfangled thing called a fax machine.
Wow.
On occasion. We did have some early email, so I could send some email back and forth on there, but if I had to send something that had visual content to graphics and so on, we slapped it onto the fax machine then. It meant, of course, timing any phone calls and keeping any of those long distance calls reasonably short, so that, the end of the day in California and early in the morning for Australia and so on to have those chats. And then waiting eagerly for a disk to arrive via FedEx with the latest build.
I was about to say, the file transfers via modem were not an option at that point.
There were a couple of projects that we were trying to do some file transfers for, but it was usually for a small module or some component. It wasn't for the whole project at a time. So
gotcha. And now, how would the contact even be established between a studio in Australia and EA in California?
The studio in Australia, well, I don't know how they originally established the contact with us, because they were already working with us on the America's Cup game. And they had already completed the America's Cup game, and I forget who was the producer on that one, but I inherited the relationship with Microforte from there. And they were one of the funnest groups of people I ever got to work with. And after shipping Demon Stalkers, I got to go down to visit them in Sydney and hang out with them, and just fell in love with the Australian culture.
Cool. Any thoughts at that time of moving down there, or trying to get some kind of larger foothold in Australia as far as game development is concerned?
At the time, I wasn't prepared to think about moving down. With the current election cycle here in America, I'm taking that idea more seriously now. I'm going to just tell you that. The wrong guy wins in November, I'm going to be looking to update my passport and see and reconnect with John DeMargariti and some of the other folks. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you totally get it. Get it.
Yep.
So so you're talking. You're working with them. Now, what was the decision making process inside EA like at that time for determining which producer or associate producer was going to be working on which project?
Right. When I first came to EA, every producer had full creative control over whatever the hell kind of projects they wanted to do. And after a bunch of that and people feeling like the portfolio is getting a little lopsided this way or a little lopsided that way, then they decided to assign each producer to a specific kind of game. So Don Daglow became the sports game producer. Joe Ibarra became the interactive fiction producer. Stuart Bond did more of the creative tools, the deluxe this, deluxe that kind of stuff. And Dave Grady got some more stuff that was a little more arcadish, but we still had a little bit of Venn diagram overlap, gray areas between some of those genres. So,
okay.
Yeah.
And so you're still deciding. So at this point, as an associate producer, you probably don't get to make a full-blown decision on your own, right?
You put together a proposal. And the proposal outlines what the game structure is going to be about, what you expect the development schedule is going to be, what you expect the budget's going to be, and then you submit it, and then some of the folks in sales and marketing look at it and kind of make their best guess as to this could sell 50,000 copies, this could sell 100,000 copies, et cetera, and calculate a little bit of hypothetical return on investment kind of thing, and then they would green light or not the projects from there.
Gotcha. Now, in these proposals that you're putting together, what role do systems take in? So, are you proposing it's going to be for this system or that system? How does that work?
Well, so certainly within EA at the time, there were certain systems that had priority, high priority. And when I came on board, all of the developers were working on these black box prototypes of this thing called the Amiga. And it was way cool. And you may remember around that era, we took out two-page ads, full two-page ads, Trip Hawkins standing there leaning on an Amiga, why Electronic Arts is committed to the Amiga. And matter of fact, when I was in the interviewing process for the job, I got to sit in on a developers meeting talking about Amiga development. And I'm looking around the room and there's a bunch of these guys that were like in the black t-shirts on the Rockstar posters that EA first released stuff with. And I'm going, oh my God, that's John Bunton, that's Ann Westfall, and you know, or John Freeman and Ann Westfall, and there's Bill Budge, and there's and I had to not fanboy all over myself at that point in time. And it took me about 3-4 weeks on the job between the time that I was treating John Freeman as a rock star and the time that I was going, oh my God, it's John. He's going to talk my ear off again. So, but I did have the privilege at the time, and I consider one of the deepest privileges I had, was getting to work with Danny Bunton.
Oh, okay.
And
yes,
that was an amazing experience. Of course, I have to explain. Danny Bunton is the person that Dan Bunton transitioned into. So later on in life, Dan Bunton was one of the first people I knew who was transgender, and that change was phenomenal because Dan Bunton was also always a very quiet, very shy, very thoughtful, very pensive, didn't seem very happy very often, but he was interesting to chat with. Danny was outgoing. Danny was bubbly. Danny was, oh, it is so good to see you again, Jeff. Let me give you a big hug. And and she was just an amazing but completely different person. And it was really wonderful to see Danny blossom. And sadly, unfortunately, Danny succumbed to cancer just like a year or two after her transition and so on. Mm-hmm. But I got to work with Dan when Danny was Dan to try to keep things not to dead name, but just to refer to the time period, on things like Modem Wars, on things like Heart of Africa, I came on board after Seven Cities of Gold, but there was a sort of sequel to Seven Cities of Gold,
Yeah.
Heart of Africa. And the other thing that really took me a little bit to get used to was growing up in Ohio. My stereotype of people with Southern accents was all redneck hicks.
Yeah.
And I meet this guy from deep in Arkansas with a thick Arkansas accent. And he's one of the sharpest, smartest, most interesting, most articulate, most insightful people I've ever met on the topic of game design. And it just blew my mind to have my stereotypes just ripped away like that. But it was one of the most amazing relationships I ever had in the game industry.
Now, I do want to, I've got to ask a little bit about this because I've spoken also with Don Daglow.
Yeah.
And he had some amazing stories about Dan/Danny. And I'd like to get from your perspective, what was different about the way that they approached game design from other designers that you knew at the time?
Danny had a really solid understanding of multiplayer board game and player interaction dynamics. In many ways, a lot of his games showed deep roots in board games. I mean, Mule, the classic, is a board game transitioned into a satisfying video game format. And it was only a few years ago that somebody actually put together the Mule board game, which I was delighted to buy. But it really had all these wonderful board game mechanics. It was the only game that you could actually play 4 players together at the same time. And so Mule was just so groundbreaking in that. And Danny was also one of the first ones to look at the idea of, could we use modem connections to make a true multiplayer experience? And that's where Modem Wars came from. And Modem Wars was a lot of effort, a lot of technical challenge, and sold totally abysmally because it showed to me that you can lose money as easily by being ahead of time as being behind the curve.
And that actually, that's an interesting transition point. And I guess it goes back to the question I had about systems. How sophisticated were the mechanisms, not just at EA, but at the other companies as well, to try to predict where the market was going? Because you're having to start development on these games, and obviously the development cycles are also getting a little bit longer. I mean, you did multiple games in 2 years at 3 companies, but now suddenly you're at EA. I'm guessing that something along the lines of Lords of Conquest Lords of Conquest, no, but Demon Stalkers was probably
Lords of Conquest, by the way, was another phenomenal group of board game designers translating their stuff into. I was a long-term Cosmic Encounter player from my college days and high school days, and getting to meet that team and wear one of my Cosmic Encounter shirts to a meeting with those guys was just phenomenal. Anyway. In terms of predicting where the market was going to go, because clearly in the early 80s, you went from Apple II to Atari, Apple II to VIC-20 to Atari to Commodore 64 and so on. And we were hitting that point mid-80s of kind of going, this is madness. This is nuts, having to rewrite every game practically from scratch just to hit the market. And it was really Tripp's strategic intent to get full bore behind the Amiga as this is the next generation home computer. Do not look at anything else. Do not look at IBM. Do not look at Apple. This is the computer that everybody should have in their home. And he put in all the resources that we could muster into those 2-page ads, into designing games that just blew away what was considered possible in those days. And we were doing some absolutely phenomenal work. And as you may recall from the time, you had the Amiga, you also had the Atari ST. So you had a Betamax VHS war going on.
Yeah.
And while Atari and Commodore were duking it out over that, then suddenly PC clones became cheap. And we were, to be fair, I think we were caught pretty flat-footed by how quickly the PC became the dominant platform for computer games. So we were a little behind the curve. Starflight was our first real design for the PC game, but it was by the time that came out, and like Bard's Tale, there were several other companies like Sierra and others that were really focused centrally on developing for the PC.
The piracy scene.
Yeah.
Since it had been your original entry point into EA, was the piracy scene on the Amiga, which didn't blossom until the A500 came out, really. But when it did come out, was that seen as more prolific than the piracy scene on DOS machines? Or was that just not even really a consideration at that point?
So what was interesting, my experience of most people who bought Amigas was that they knew this was a cutting edge, state-of-the-art machine. They knew it was kind of an underdog in the marketplace. So they did not want to do anything that would sabotage the success of the machine. And so there was not as big of a pirate market. Compare that to the Atari ST, which were primarily bought by people who were too cheap to be able to afford an Amiga. Truth to tell, the primary selling point for the ST was it's almost as good as this Amiga and hundreds of dollars cheaper. Yeah. So these were people who, by their nature, were looking to find ways to not have to spend too much money. And then piracy on the Atari ST was rampant. And what so happened was one day at EA, Tripp was working late. Phone rings. He just decides on a whim to pick up the phone and answer whatever customer is calling in. And he gets somebody on the line who wants to complain about how come you guys are doing all these games for the Amiga and you've only released a few things for the Atari ST. And Tripp says, well, I'm surprised you say that because he just released this game and this game and this game and this game. And the guy said, oh yeah, I got that one already. And Tripp said, wow, you got all those really fast. How did you get them so fast? Oh, I pirated them. The caller probably never knew who the hell he was talking to at the time. But after the call, the very next day, Tripp sent an email to the entire company halting all development for the Atari ST.
Wow.
So one Atari user confirmed what we already sort of knew, and it pissed off Tripp so much that we halted all development for the ST. Now, the IBM, yes, there was a potential for piracy there, but the real issue was the IBMs were starting to ship with hard drives. And so the idea of playing a game off of the floppy disk versus installing it on the hard drive became a serious consumer convenience question. And it's really inconvenient to be asking your players, okay, I know you got the whole game loaded up on your hard drive, and it's perfectly fine that you bought the game and you put on your hard drive, but you still got to stick this disk in. And that just wasn't flying anymore. So that pretty much killed the whole idea of copy protection. At that point was when hard drives became prevalent on PCs.
And that idea of the hard drive installation, from a design standpoint, because, and this is, as someone who played a lot of games, both European and US, around this time, how did that installation on the hard drive change the way that you were designing the games? And were you still thinking, well, okay, we'll make the DOS version hard drive installable, but the Amiga people usually don't have a hard drive. Do we somehow limit the design so it's still playable from disk, or we're just worried about that problem later?
Yeah. Essentially, what really started happening was we designed primarily for PCs with hard drives. it enabled us to then ship games that had more than 1 or 2 discs in the box, and suddenly start shipping games that had 6, 8, 10 discs in the box, and just said, okay, you're going to have this phenomenal game experience after you spend an hour installing all of these discs onto your hard drive. Now, the Amiga discs and Atari ST discs and that generation of discs had substantially more storage than your standard 5.25-inch floppy for IBMs. So you could still put, what might fit on 6 or 8 IBM floppies onto a couple 3 Amiga discs back then. But it wasn't long before the writing was on the wall that the Amigas were going to be kind of an afterthought, and you'll do the best you can with what you got on those, but we're really going to design to satisfy the IBM market. And then we just had to deal with all of the headache of, okay, is the player going to be on a CGA or an EGA or a VGA graphics card, and what sound card do they have? And we replaced all of our porting to different computers issues with all the different configurations that could be done on there. Oh, thank you. We have cats eating rubber bands.
So I do have to ask, because that is also one of these interesting phenomenon at the time. And for example, I'm looking at Starflight right now on Moby Games, and all the different configurations, the monochrome graphics, the EGA, the non-EGA, Tandy graphics, EGA graphics, and CGA and so forth. How was that done from a technical standpoint? Did you actually have to have 3 different sets of the graphics on the discs? Was there some kind of internal software to be able to convert the files, the video files? How is that done from a technical standpoint back then?
For a while, it really was 3 sets of artwork on the discs. Wow. And then once we got to a point of saying, okay, most people have VGAs, we can just create the VGA artwork, and then we'll come up with some way of reducing it to other systems as needed on there. But yeah, there was certainly a while where we had to recreate the art 3 different ways.
Oh, that's insane.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, okay. So now and I know we've gone off on a few tangents here, but I think that this really fleshes out the day-to-day life at EA at the time. So all these resources have gone into the Amiga. Yep. It's clearly not a success, especially not in the US.
Yeah.
And the Atari ST is obviously not an option. And is there any point during all of this where voices are saying we should get onto console, look at what's happening at the NES, or is that something that Tripp is simply not considering?
Well, you get into the whole issue of the monopolies that NES and Sega had on the production of the games, and that from a financial perspective, it just did not make sense to be putting in all of this effort and all this budget only to have Nintendo or Sega get the lion's share of the profits from your games. And toward the last, maybe 6-8 months that I was there was when, and you probably heard about this, was when Tripp did the clean room dissection of the Sega cartridges.
Yes.
So that we could produce our own Sega cartridges without violating any non-disclosures, without violating any proprietary software, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it scared the hell out of Sega. So that they eventually changed their terms, and I don't remember exactly how the legalities worked out. But certainly, at that point in time, you were either a computer game company or a video game company. And there really wasn't much crossover because of that issue of control of the manufacturing and distribution.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you were still there when that happens. Was it somewhat known inside the company that this was happening, or does it come out as a surprise that suddenly it's like, okay, we've got a way of getting onto console?
Oh, no. We knew that we had assigned a small little commando team of some of our best engineers to reverse engineer the Sega cartridges. And Trip made it known that this was going to be our blow against the monopolistic forces of the cartridge companies. So he was proud of working on that. It wasn't a secret that we were doing this, but we had to make sure we were very, very clean and very consistent about being able to hold up in court that we were not doing anything that violated any of their proprietary secrets.
Gotcha.
We had completely reverse engineered it from scratch.
Okay. And so do you, and you sort of already said it, I mean, the last 6 months that you're there. So what is the final project that you work on while you're there?
Trying to remember, I think it was Demon Stalkers was, I think, the last one that actually got published.
Okay.
From the time I was there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you're doing Demon Stalkers. That comes out, I believe, in '89, and then you jump over to Origin.
Well, there was a short period of time when I left Electronic Arts and tried running my own independent game development company, contracting to some other companies. And
okay. Yeah, well, let's talk about that.
I was flailing about at that, working on different projects. The only one that I think ever made it to market was we got the contract to do a Macintosh conversion of Gauntlet.
Okay.
And so we did Gauntlet, and we had to do both black and white artwork and color artwork because that was right at the transition time between the black and white Macs and the color Macs. And they could not provide us with any of the original audio files. Ooh. So if you played that Macintosh version of Gauntlet, you literally heard my voice going, "Warrior needs food badly. Ooh, ow, ooh, ooh, ow, ooh, ooh." And my wife, Stephanie, was doing the Valkyrie. And we had one of our other programmers who could do a nice falsetto doing the elf. So it was all, we recreated those voices from scratch on that one. But we had a span of time where like 3 of our projects were working with companies that went belly up within a short span of time, and they all got canceled. And I was in the middle of talking to Origin Systems about doing a contract project for them at the time. And then I had to call them back up and say, look, I'm going to be closing down shop. We just can't make this viable with all of these projects getting canceled. And I was friends with Warren Spector at the time. And Warren said, well, you know, we're going to have another opening for a producer down here. Would you want to come down and interview? And I thought to myself, I can't live in Texas. I don't want to drive a pickup truck. I don't want to be around cattle and cactus and oil wells. And I don't want to wear cowboy boots and all this crap. He said, no, we'll fly you down. Just come on down, take a look. So I flew down to Austin. And I don't know how much you know about Texas and Austin, but Austin is
a different ballgame. Yeah.
Austin is not Texas. Austin is this wonderful progressive oasis in the middle of this very conservative state. And Warren drove us around town, pointing out all the bookstores. Austin at the time had more bookstores per capita than any other city in the country.
Wow.
And pointing out the houses that were available. And this was shortly after my first child was born. And, you know, I was living out in the Silicon Valley area where housing prices were just absolutely unaffordable. And I'm looking at these houses and he's going, it's probably about $85,000, maybe $90,000. I'm doing the math in my head and I'm going, wait a second, I could have a house for, 3 times the size of the apartment I'm renting and paying less than that. And I could, have a backyard and a garage. And so, okay. And they got cool bookstores around the corner. Okay, sign me up. And I fell in love with Austin. Of course, the barbecue didn't hurt either. The barbecue was phenomenal. So that's how I came down and ended up working for Origin Systems for a couple of years, working with Richard Garriott and Chris Roberts and Warren and everybody then.
Now, the company that you had, was that Sorcerer's Apprentice?
Yes. Oh, yep.
Okay.
You looked up my history there. Yes.
No, I actually, on Moby Games, the Mac version of Gauntlet actually has that credit as one of the screenshots.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so
It
yes,
says, yes.
I didn't realize that we actually had a visible credit somewhere for Sorcerer's Apprentice. I
Yeah,
should have
with the
realized
logo, with the image of
Yeah.
it looks like a sorcerer's hat that looks very annoyed.
Yeah. And I should have forethought decided naming a software company about a mouse who screwed up everything he tried to do was not the best of models there, but
Yeah. Now, your contract for that was with Mindscape, right?
Mindscape,
not
yes.
with Tengen.
No, Mindscape.
Okay.
Oh,
okay.
one of the other contracts we almost got
Mm-hmm.
was to do, and this is Atari 2600, long after anybody thought the Atari 2600 still had a market. But somebody came to us saying, would you guys be willing to do the Atari 2600 version of Tetris?
Oh.
Now, I'm not going to go into the lengthy details, but you probably are well aware of the fact that the rights for Tetris were convoluted, were often misrepresented, and so on. So just as we were about to sign the contract, somebody called us back up going, we're not quite sure we actually have the rights for this game, so we're going to have to That was one of the things that went belly up from under us at the time. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. That you should probably count your blessings that did not happen, because that would have just wrapped you up in I'm going to say a shit show of an issue.
Did you see the movie they made?
No, I heard such terrible things about the historical accuracy of it that I just let it be.
Yeah, no, it's not historically accurate at all, but it is entertaining. So.
Oh, yeah. At some point, I'll probably have to watch it, maybe do a special episode where but a friend of mine who also contributes to this show did an audio commentary for it, where he corrected all the things that were wrong about it.
Oh,
but yeah. Oh yeah, it's quite terrible in that regard.
Yeah.
But no, Tetris, the whole Tetris rights story is a phenomenal issue, especially if you understand the politics of the Soviet government at that point. And also their stance on copyrights. It becomes a fascinating story in that light, but I'm getting lost on tangents.
Yeah, we're off on a tangent there.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
No. Tangents are just par for the course here, so that's okay. I'm
sure a lot of this will end up on the cutting room floor.
No. I kind of let most things slide because I feel that it's important for people to get a feeling for who the interview subjects are as human beings. Because if you understand who people are, it also puts the work and the art in a different context.
Okay.
But that's just me.
Who we are as human beings. Well, I like long walks on the beach. No, I'm not going to go that route.
I like pina coladas. No, okay.
And this is just Dr. Pepper.
Yeah, that's what I'd say too. This is just coffee. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
So, back to the issue. So, Sorcerer's Apprentice, for a variety of reasons, is not successful, and you end up in Austin at Origin as a producer.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Now, again, we're transitioning from one company to the next, but we kind of jumped over it. Why did you decide to try to go it alone and leave EA?
I made that decision at a time when EA was changing its culture pretty radically and was no longer the fun little startup it used to be and was getting more and more corporate. And for me, the straw that made me really think it was time to go on was that Dave Grady had left. And I loved Dave Grady, and he was a wonderful person to work for. And I got assigned to a producer who I will not name that I just did not get along with at that point in time. And I'd been there for 3 years, which in company history terms made me a very grizzled veteran, being 3 years there at Electronic Arts. So,
gotcha.
Yeah, I felt it was time to just try the great dream of go ahead and start your own business and get rich on your own effort. Yeah.
No,
well, I ended up selling off some of my founder's stock in Electronic Arts to be able to fund that company. And if I'd taken the other fork in the road and just held on to all that stock for a year after going public, I would have retired right then and there. Mm-hmm. But such is life. Life is full of regrets.
It's true.
It's an interesting life. Yeah.
People with no regrets have not really lived.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So, okay, now you get to Origin Systems. It's 1990 or thereabouts.
89, end of 89.
End of 89. Mm-hmm. And they are just, it's the Ultima series. And has Wing Commander shipped at this point? No, not yet.
It had not yet shipped. It was still in development and all. And we were working on my first major project for them, which was Savage Empire. Mm-hmm. And Wing Commander was under Warren's producerhood. And they were kind of neck and neck in terms of which was going to ship first. So it ended up that as we were competing for playtest resources, that Wing Commander got the priority to ship before Christmas. And I think Savage Empire was one of the best Christmas products that shipped in January. Yeah. But anyway, I can take credit for one small little detail in Wing Commander, though, which is if you look at the blueprints that shipped with the game, all of the explosives are measured in terms of ESKs.
Okay.
And nobody ever publicly divulged what ESKs were. But ESK is a measurement of explosive capacity measured in earth-shattering kabooms. Earth-shattering kabooms.
Okay, I'm going to have to
I threw in a Marvin the Martian reference into Wing Commander there. The other thing that I can take credit for, which was in Wing Commander 2, was as we were brainstorming characters for Wing Commander 2, I said, let's do a Kilrathi defector, and we're going to call him Hobbs. And we're going to have everybody claim that he was named after a great revered human philosopher and was never in on the joke of Calvin and they kept that in the game. That's all the more credit I can take for any of the genius that was Wing Commander.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Well, as someone who had those blueprints framed on his wall for many, many years.
Oh, really? Wonderful.
Yeah. They were part of my decor in my game room back in my single days when I had a house that had a game room. So that Sweet. Was up on the wall. And yeah, I'm actually going to have to open up the box and check those out again. And so was the idea of a Kilrathi defector already in the game, or was that yours whole cloth then?
It was in the brainstorming process we went through for Wing Commander 2.
Okay.
And we kind of said, okay, here's the cast of pilots we've got. What are we going to add to? How are we going to change the storyline, et cetera, et cetera.
Gotcha.
And,
awesome.
And that was one of the better ideas that came up in there that stuck with it. On there.
Now, when you say this brainstorming session, were they pulling in people from all over the company for these sessions, or how did that work? What was that mechanic like?
They were keeping it open for a lot of the people, whether they were assigned to the project or not at that point in time. So, Warren and I, when we were the two main producers on there, a lot of times our creative direction and strategy came out of meetings with Dallas Snell and Richard Garriott and Chris Roberts and Warren and myself.
Oh, okay.
And it was the five of us kind of going. And that's how the Worlds of Ultima games kind of spun off, was that in one of those meetings, we said we need to find a way to monetize all the investment we sunk into the Ultima 6 engine. But Richard wants to own any of the Ultima games creatively. So we're not going to do another game set in Britannia. But what if we use the same technology and the same engine, the same drivers to do different genres and kind of, spin-off side stories? So we pitched one idea, which was to do a Victorian era genre mashup of stuff from H.G. Wells, stuff of Dracula and Bram Stoker and Sherlock Holmes and yada, yada, yada. And that was my pitch. And Warren had a pitch to do a Lost Worlds romance story of dinosaurs and primitive tribes and Edgar Rice Burroughs, yada, yada, yada. Scheduling wise, we decided to go with the Lost Worlds dinosaur one first, and I was available to start on that project when Warren wasn't. So we ended up taking each other's ideas and adopting them in our own ways. But
interesting.
It did give me the wonderful opportunity, probably the team I am proudest of having worked with during all of my years was the Savage Empire team. And part of that was because I got to work with Aaron Alston. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the name Aaron Alston. Aaron Alston was a writer who was well revered in the paper role-playing game industry. So he wrote a lot of supplements for role-playing games like Champions, and he did a lot of stuff for Steve Jackson. And there is nobody in the world who I could find who was a bigger fan of Edgar Rice Burroughs' fiction. So if we wanted somebody who could really create a storyline for this Edgar Rice Burroughs style Lost Worlds romance, he was perfect for it. And he was one of the sweetest, funnest, most lovable people to work with, period, the end. He even humored me when I said, could we work the Three Stooges in here? I don't know what struck me about that one. But if you ever played Savage Empire, you will find that the Three Stooges are all in the game somewhere.
Oh, really?
Yes, right. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, Savage Empire is unfortunately one that I did not get to play, but I was an Amiga.
You're not alone.
So.
The basic idea was we do these different genres that are not Britannia, and we will attract the superset of Ultima players and fans of this other genre. Instead, we just got the tiny little intersection of Ultima fans who happen to be. So it was abysmal, and it and Martian Dreams both sold terribly. And in my thoughts, Savage Empire came out a year before the movie Jurassic Park.
Oh, yeah.
If we had released Savage Empire in the year that Jurassic Park released, it would have probably taken off.
True.
Yeah.
True. You guys would have been the only ones on the shelves with a dinosaur on the cover.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, and this is another interesting question, because obviously nowadays games can linger as long as we want on Steam. You can have a game that releases and then takes 3 years worth of patching, and then suddenly it can take off and be a hit. What was the window of opportunity for sales back then? Because you did have to have a physical product, physical inventory, and so forth. What was that like?
I mean, basically, you had a span of maybe 3 or 4 months to get momentum. And especially if you didn't sell around the Christmas season, the odds were pretty stacked against you. And I would argue that I probably worked on 24 different published games, the vast majority of which had a shelf life of less than 6 months. And
wow,
as a developer, it's really always fun and a great ego boost to go into the mall and see in the GameStop, Electronic Boutique, whomever, see your game up on the shelf and being promoted. But it's also equally depressing to go back into that store 3-4 months later and see in the bargain bin.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's got to be tough.
Yeah.
So when you're bringing this game out, and this is, I guess, an aspect we should also talk about, promotion. So relationships with the magazines, conversations or work that you did with the marketing departments and so forth. So as a producer, you're not just talking to the graphic artists, the programmers, and so forth, you're also having to coordinate these other aspects of a product. Let's talk first briefly what was that like at Origin, and then maybe we can compare it with the previous companies you had been working at.
Okay. Well, at the time, there was one magazine in particular that was the be-all and end-all for the market, and that was Computer Gaming World. And I don't know if you knew any of the guys that ran Computer Gaming World.
And I haven't met any of them, no.
Russell and Johnny Wilson and Alan Emmerich. And so, it was very important that you got a prototype of your game into the hands of one of those guys, or they assigned a good reviewer to do it. And if you got lucky, they'd put it on the cover. Savage Empire made the cover of Computer Gaming World the month it released, which was wonderful. And they had a very nice glowing review. Skipping forward real briefly, a little bit ahead, a couple of years later, and I'm at Microprose, and we're developing a game called Master of Orion. And Alan Emmerich was a friend of mine at the time, and Alan Emmerich was one of the lead editors at Computer Gaming World, and I made sure he got a copy of that. And I told him at the time, hey, this could be better than Civilization. And he visibly rolled his eyes. And he was so skeptical. And then a couple weeks later, he calls me back and goes, damn, you're right. But we'll get to the rest of that story later. Yeah. So it really was building relationships with the magazines, the magazine editors, even down to people like Jerry Pournelle, the famous science fiction author, who also on the side used to write columns for, was it Byte? I think it was Byte magazine.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you're talking to them, you're trying to hype the games, get them the promotion that they need so that people can find out about them. Did you also have any contact with retailers or the big chains as a producer?
As a producer, no, we didn't really get a direct contact. That was usually our sales and marketing department that were handling the relationships with the retailers. Where my intersection happened was sometimes in the design of the ads.
Okay.
So if you get into, someplace out in my garage, I've got the framed copies of the ads for Savage Empire and some of the other games I worked on in there, Lords of Conquest and so on. So I had some input on that. Savage Empire was very deliberately designed to feel like one of those bombastic pulp fiction, see amazing wonders, battle fierce dinosaurs, yada, yada, yada stuff. I think I've borrowed most of my vocabulary from early Stan Lee.
Yeah.
Excelsior.
And those ads, and I actually remember seeing these in magazines, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. I'm looking at it right now. You had for the time, especially for American magazines, large screenshots on one side of the ad. And this was something that kind of irked me a lot back in the day because I traveled to the States once a year to visit my grandparents, and I was living in Germany or in Argentina and then in Germany. So I knew what European ads for games look like. And over there, it was commonplace to have relatively large screenshots of the games, even in the 8-bit days. And in the States, it's always seemed to be like a taboo. Don't show the game. Don't show the game. Or put it in very small screenshots at the bottom of the page.
Yeah.
But you went full blown. You're showing off these nice big screenshots.
Yeah, just pulling up the Savage Empire ad with 4 pretty decent resolution screens on that one. Is that what you're looking at?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Two-fisted adventure, spine-tingling graphics, pulse-pounding sound, cliff-hanging excitement.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all my verbiage. Yes, right.
Yeah. I can imagine the Worlds of Ultima thing probably would have turned a lot of people off at that point. Because if you weren't an Ultima fan or you were familiar with the Ultima style games, the Savage Empire thing you're going to be wondering, how does it fit in?
Yeah. No, we were hoping that the the Ultima and the Lord British Presents would be our primary selling point. At that point in time, but it didn't work out that way.
Yeah, too bad.
Yeah.
So you worked on this product. It ships.
Mm-hmm.
What is the decision process inside of Origin for where you go? Going back to my question about your interactions with the magazines and so forth.
Yeah.
Was that a fairly standard experience at EA and Epyx and so forth before that, or was Origin a little bit different in the way that it approached that kind of relationship?
I don't remember having the relationship with the magazines at Electronic Arts at the time. At Origin, you wore a few more hats in that role. It was not, at the time, circa 89, 90 or so, Electronic Arts was hundreds and hundreds of people, and Origin was about 50 or 60 people.
Gotcha.
So it was a much smaller operation. Now, flip side of it was, and we didn't get into talking about, around 88, 89 was also when I was one of the people founding the Game Developers Conference.
Yes.
And being in charge of recruiting speakers for the Game Developers Conference, I built out the network, including the Computer Gaming World guys who were sponsors for some of our receptions and stuff for the very first conferences. So when I first came to Origin, and I came to Origin in November of 89, and then the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas was in January, and I go out to CES along with Dallas and some of our other folks. And first few hours, I'm wandering around the show floor and talking to people that I knew in the industry. And Dallas Snell just looks at me and goes, "Is there anybody in the business you don't know?" So I had the black book from hell at the time, and thanks part to being one of the people that ran the Game Developers Conference, and in part having had to do a lot of networking in search of jobs through the 80s.
Wow. So now, how did your involvement with the Game Developers Conference project start?
Oh, okay. We'll go back in time a little bit. Right around the time I left Electronic Arts and was running Sorcerer's Apprentice, and I was friends with Chris Crawford because he'd done a project for Electronic Arts at the time, and he decided to invite a bunch of his game industry friends over to his house to just spend a day shooting the shit about the business and about being a game designer. And nobody had ever really done that before. So he had about 20, 25 people. And if you go do a little Google search on the Computer Game Developers Conference, you'll probably find a photo of those 20 people or so at Chris's house at the time. And I'm wearing a bright red shirt. I'm easy to spot on that photo.
Oh, really?
So yes.
Oh, cool.
So when all was said and done, we got to the end of the afternoon and we all started saying, we got to do this more often. And does anybody want to make a real conference out of this? And about half a dozen of us raised our hands. So there were 6 of us, Chris Crawford included, who founded the Computer Game Developers Conference. And we each divvied up the roles, and I got to be the person in charge of recruiting the speakers. And cool. I remember telling many of the speakers, no, trust me, the Holiday Inn in Milpitas is a much nicer hotel than it sounds. Because I don't know if you know anything about the Bay Area, but Milpitas is like the New Jersey. It's the back end of the Bay Area. It's not well. It's kind of the cheap side of town. But it was a very good conference hotel for our first conference. At the same time, our board was very, very skittish about spending money that we didn't have. So they didn't want to get any T-shirts to sell. And I said, okay, well, you let an enterprising member of the board spend their own money out of pocket to do T-shirts. And I got to sell T-shirts for the first 3 conferences and made a killing on selling T-shirts.
Awesome.
On this. But anyway, but it was really fun to recruit some really great speakers for those. In particular, for the second one I did, we did a president's panel. We got the CEOs of EA and Sierra and several other Microprose and so on to all be in one room talking about business and doing Q&A at the same time. And wow. I felt I can tell Trip Hawkins where you need to go and what time you need to be there. That felt powerful.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
I really wish somebody would have recorded all of those speeches, because I'm sure that that would have been wonderful insight, especially from a historical standpoint.
Oh yeah. So, no, not those early ones. First real conference we did, we had maybe about 150, 175 people at that one. The next one we got, I'm not sure if we broke 250, but it quickly mushroomed from there up to the 10,000 people several years later.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So you're helping organize this big event, and I did pull up that picture you were talking about. Yeah, you're right there in the middle, bottom row.
Yep.
Very cool. And so the event works. You're now at Origin. So you have all these great contacts.
Yep.
So what is the next project while you're at Origin?
Well, after shipped Savage Empire, I was going to actually start working as producer for Wing Commander 2. But we had a change in structure, and I kind of joke that Origin management decided to redesign the org chart and left me off.
Ooh.
Yeah. So what they wanted to try doing was splitting the producer role into a creative director and a project manager role. And they experimented with that for about a year and decided that wasn't working, but I wasn't fitting into that model at the time. So
that concludes part 1 of my interview with Jeff. We'll be back for a lot more exciting stuff in part 2. And remember, hit like, subscribe, blah, 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 and have fun. Another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.